Thanks for being here, everyone. All right, it is officially the top of the hour, so while I keep one eye on the waiting room to let in more people, I will get started with introducing our incredible lecturer today. So before I talk about her, I want to talk about what this experience is all about. So the On One Foot Jewish Faculty Lecture Series is a virtual learning series that features a different Jewish faculty member from University of Memphis or Rhodes College to spotlight the incredible Jewish intellectual talent we have here in Memphis for the entire community to enjoy. Welcome, community members. Thank you for being here. And today's lecturer is the incredible Dr. Rebecca Tuvel, who's a professor of philosophy at Rhodes College. She teaches philosophy of sex and gender, philosophy of race and racism, ethics of identity, medical ethics, and an introduction to philosophy course based on the sci-fi series Black Mirror. I would love to audit that class because that sounds so fascinating. She got her BA at McGill University and her PhD at Vanderbilt University. So with that, I will officially hand the mic over to Dr. Tuvel.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thanks to you all for being here. It's been an intention of mine to connect more with the Jewish community here in Memphis, and this is a great opportunity to begin doing that. So I really appreciate you all being here.
Maybe I'll do your phone. There we go. Thank you.
Okay. So today I'm going to speak to you about my work on transracial identity. I'm currently finishing up a book project called Changing Race, the Metaphysics and Ethics of Transracialism. And I'll be talking to you just a bit about some of the arguments that I explore in that book. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A part especially. So in recent years, a growing number of people have been featured in the media for lying about their race. You might recall Rachel Dolezal, featured on the top left here, who was head of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and who had long been identifying as a Black woman. And it was then revealed that she was born to white parents, and much vitriol and shaming were passed her way on social media. And there have been other academics not entirely dissimilar to Dolezal, just some of them are featured here. Below Dolezal, we have Jessica Krug, who was associate professor of history at George Washington University, also identifying as Black for most of her adult life, but actually of Jewish descent, fired from her job, and also subject to online vitriol. On the top right, we have a University of Wisconsin-Madison graduate student named CV Vitolo Haddad, who was identifying as Black, but was actually of Italian descent. And below her, we have Andrea Smith, who was identifying as an Indigenous scholar, but then turned out not to have the relevant Indigenous roots. These are not the only individuals to be accused of lying about their race or otherwise identifying in some way or another with a race in a manner considered immoral. So just to give you a couple other examples, on the top left here, we have the German model Martina Big, who has undergone numerous plastic surgeries and melanin injections as part of her effort to become a Black woman. Big is not the only one to pursue surgical measures to align her public presentation with her self-identity. Below Big, we have the British social media influencer Ollie London, who has identified as a Korean male and undertaken different surgical measures to present as such. Above Ollie London, we have Ronnie Gladden, who writes movingly about their identification as both transgender and transracial. So transgracial, as Gladden describes it. Gladden presents as a stereotypically phenotypic Black male, but discusses how since a very young age, they've identified as internally as a white woman. They actually are currently finishing up a book called White Girl Within. Then to the right of Gladden, we have Jadu, who is born white and male, but identifies also as transracial, as a woman, and as Filipina. And below Jadu, we have South African actress Mary Molefe van Heerden, who is phenotypically Black, but identifies as white, and has talked about being raised in a white family and how she's never really identified with Blackness or learned how to be Black, in her words. All right, so we have a number of individuals here. And one thing I'll say at the outset is that we ought to be careful not to homogenize these people as if they're all the same in one way or another. They are just like any group of individuals who might share certain features in common. They're internally diverse, they have different stories, different ways of identifying, and our ethical evaluation of these cases should also be sensitive to the differences among these people. But what I want to argue to you today is that the standard response to this cluster of cases ought to be rethought. So the standard interpretation is that these individuals are liars, deceivers, ethnic frauds, mentally disordered, or exploitative racial passers out for some personal or financial gain. The response can vary if you're born white versus born a person of color. In fact, Ronnie Gladden's story has really flown under the radar. But by and large, the reaction to these individuals is that this is not an acceptable form of identification. So I think that we need a different way of approaching this growing kind of identification. I think we're seeing more and more people coming to identify as transracial, and that we need the concept of transraciality to actually understand and describe what's going on. And that in line with that, we should be wary of making quick and easy judgments about what these people are doing, their mental histories, what motivates them, and all of that. So my thesis is twofold. The first point is that these individuals, as I said, highlight the need for a new concept, the concept of transracial identity. So one thing I'll be intent to argue is that these individuals really aren't well described by the concept of racial passing. And that's been a big critique of my work, is that, hey, you're just talking about people who are passing. I don't think that concept does the work. But second, and more importantly, I think that these transracial efforts provide us with a valuable opportunity to revisit and rethink the concept of race and criteria for racial membership. Okay, so that is the plan for today. All right, let me just say a little bit about why I think passing is not up to the task. So what is passing? So in my view, we can understand racial passing as taking place when somebody's racial identity aligns with their presumed race, or their race recorded at birth. And when they passively or actively permit others to think of them as a member of a different race, even though they don't think of themselves that way, for some purpose, for instance, to escape prejudice and persecution. So a couple of examples here. Some of you may have seen Spike Lee's 2018 film Black Klansman, represented on the top left here. It's the true story of Black detective Ron Stallworth's brave effort to infiltrate the Ku Klux Klan in Colorado Springs in the late 1970s. So Stallworth, represented on the right here, posed as white over the phone and then recruited a white officer to show up in person when necessary. And in the film, that white officer was played by Adam Driver, who in the movie is also represented as Jewish. So both individuals in the movie pass as white. Right? Driver hides his Jewish identity, and Stallworth obviously hides his Black identity. These individuals are both best defined as racial passers because, again, their own racial identities actually align with their birth race, right? The way that we understand what their races ought to be according to their ancestries, but they are passing for some specific reason, right? The history of passing is very familiar to us Jews and certainly to Black Americans. So the Allison Hobbs book, A Chosen Exile, is a really excellent history of racial passing in American life. Also on the right here, I have the example of Frida Belinfante. Some of you may be familiar with her story. She was a Jewish lesbian who participated in the Dutch resistance efforts to Nazism. And among her brave efforts was her role in the 1943 bombing of the Amsterdam Civil Registry, which sought to destroy the official population records used by the Nazis to track down Jews, homosexuals, and other people targeted for destruction. So following that bombing, Belinfante disguised herself as a man to escape arrest and execution, and as a non-Jew. So I would say that Belinfante is best described as someone who temporarily passed as non-Jewish and who temporarily passed as a man, right? We wouldn't say that she was transgender. I would argue we shouldn't say that. We should say rather that she was passing. And this is also what I want to say about the difference between racial passers and transracial individuals. Okay, so that's my argument for why I think passing isn't the right concept here. So what is transraciality? So on my definition of what it means to be transracial, someone is transracial if their racial identity differs from their race recorded at birth, what I call their presumed race. And S is aware of this difference, but thinks of themselves as a member of another presumed race and may take steps to be perceived that way. Okay. So the key difference between a passer and a transracial individual relates to how it is that they privately understand themselves. Now, I mean, I acknowledge that some cases of racial passing are blurrier and that some passers did come to identify ultimately with the race that they passed as. And I would say those liminal cases are sort of in between, but that generally speaking, we can draw the distinction between the two phenomena. So, Rachel Dolezal herself pulls on this distinction in her book, In Full Color, Finding My Place in a Black and White World. She argues that, contrary to popular opinion, I wasn't merely passing as a Black woman. She says, passing has existed in the US as long as white people have oppressed people of color, which is to say for its entire history. My situation was different. Just as a transgender person might be born male but identify as female, I wasn't pretending to be something that I wasn't, but expressing something I already was. I wasn't passing as Black. I was Black, and there was no going back. Just two other instructive cases. These are two jazz musicians. On the left, we have Maz Mesro, who was born into a Russian Jewish family, but whose experience in the African-American jazz scene led him to identify as Black. He called himself a voluntary Negro who believed that he had become Black, and when he was imprisoned for selling drugs in 1940, he identified as Black so he could be housed with Black prisoners. On the right, there's Johnny Otis, who was born into a Greek family, but grew up in a Black neighborhood and married a Black woman, and who stated, quote, "As a kid, I decided that if our society dictated that one had to be Black or white, I would be Black. I am Black environmentally, psychologically, culturally, emotionally, and intellectually." And Otis further stated, quote, "America is full of Negroes who are much lighter than I and whites who are much darker." So whatever you want to say about Mesro or Otis, I think what's clear is that their identifications as Black seem sincere, and that they have clearly express strong affinity with the Black cultural communities in which they found themselves. So they too would be better described, in my view, as transracial given their racial identities rather than passers. All right, so what is it that we should be saying about all of these different individuals, right? This transracial phenomenon, and how it is that we should be classifying people racially. So these are really, really big questions, obviously, right? What is race? Huge question. It's the dominant question people debate in the philosophy of race literature, lots of different competing views. And how is it that people should be classified racially? All right. So I'll just say a little bit to you about how I think we should be answering these questions, and I would love to hear from you, because in fact, I think Jews and the way that Jews understand identity and criteria for membership is really central to this project. And so I'm curious also to hear from members of the Jewish community here. All right, what is race? Really big question. So I'm a social kind theorist when it comes to race. What does that mean? I think that races are groups of people that are sorted according to actual or imagined ancestry. They're social kinds fundamentally, though. That means that to understand what they are, we have to appeal to the ways humans speak about, treat, and interact with each other. All right, what exactly does this mean? Let me unpack this a little bit because it can be kind of confusing. All right, I want to just make two distinctions between a base property and a social position. What is a base property? So a base property is any feature deemed necessary for some socially significant position. So for instance, to be classified as a senior citizen in the US, you have to have the base property of being 65 years or older. So base properties are can be all sorts of things, right? You can classify people up according to many base properties, right? Natural redheads, people over a certain height, whatever it might be. It's not, in other words, intrinsically, interesting. It's often made significant by society. That's where we get to the second distinction, a social position. So a social position are the norms, the expectations, the social roles, and all of that are assumed by those taken to have the base property. So for instance, senior citizens might be accorded certain privileges and rights based on their classification. That's an entirely social phenomenon that's just pulling from the fact that all these individuals have this base property. Okay. So, I did something bad there, didn't I? Okay, we're back. Sorry. All right, so let's consider an example just to make this more concrete. So consider eye color. So I want you to consider eye color because relatively speaking, eye color is when it comes to how it is that we classify ourselves socially. But let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, that eye color became the most important base property. That is what we cared about, and that if you had a dark eye color, you get placed at the top of the hierarchy. Your socioeconomic status, your career prospects, your dating prospects, everything is vastly improved as a result. So you have a dark eye color, you might walk around society very proudly, you might never wear sunglasses, you want people to know that you have a dark eye color. But in contrast, let's imagine that people with light eye colors, the base property of light eye colors, are regarded as inferior, as less attractive, as less desirable across all measures, and are treated accordingly. So in this kind of eye-centric hierarchical society that I am imagining, we could distinguish again between the base property of having dark versus light eye color, and then the social position, the norms, the expectations, the roles, etc., that are ascribed to people with dark versus light eye colors. So I want you really to imagine that this is a hugely significant way of evaluating people, right? That we can, in fact, it's maybe the first thing that people want to assess about somebody. Now I want us to ask, right, what's the best explanation for the phenomena and the classifications that we perceive in this eye color centric society? All right, how would an alien explain what they perceive? This is always helpful because it can be really difficult to get behind our particular society's way of seeing things. So imagine that this alien, who looks pretty friendly, although mind you, I don't know what this alien is holding, maybe not so friendly after all. This alien visits Earth and keen to return home like a good, responsible teacher alien, able to explain their observations on Earth. And what do they see? They see this really well-defined kind of two-tiered class system that privileges those with dark eye colors over those with light eye colors. What are they likely to conclude? They're likely to conclude that eye color directly impacts somebody's life prospects. And although they might not really understand the mechanism by which that happens, they're going to are going to assume probably a naturalistic explanation. In other words, they're going to assume that somebody's eye color somehow is connected to them being more successful and more attractive and whatever, right? They're going to just see the fact that all these people share eye colors and that they have all of these relevant traits and social positions as a result. So they're going to, in other words, conclude that the base property of having a dark eye color is the thing that is determining the position of somebody in a hierarchy, in a better place in the hierarchy. But what happens now when a second alien comes to visit Earth and they're from the same planet as the first alien, but they go to a different location? And then when these aliens come together, the second alien says, I didn't notice eye color to be significant at all, actually, in the location I went. Nobody really seemed to pay much attention to it. The first alien is going to be shocked, probably, right? Like, what? They're going to have to revise their explanation, is what they're going to have to do, because they will realize that, in fact, although they assumed that there was something essential to one's eye color that determined their social position, that was actually just an illusion, right? And it is the way that people made eye color significant that really explains the groupings of people that we then came to see. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. This is what a social kind approach to race argues as well, right? That the same way that the alien had a naturalistic explanation in hand, they actually needed a social explanation instead. Social kind theorists of race argue that while we believe race to be a natural category, that it's somehow a natural kind of biologically significant division within the species, that's actually an illusion. And it's rather a kind of grouping that we have made significant through our social practices. So we think that the races, not unlike the alien, right, thinks about eye colors, the way people are divided in terms of eye colors, we think that they're sorted naturalistically. That's an illusion, though. We might say that you need a certain percent of recent ancestry to qualify as a member of a race, but actually that percentage of ancestry doesn't track any meaningful biological categories. And in fact, what that percentage is has, as we know, changed throughout history, depending on a particular society's rules. Okay. And Adam Hochman writes in a helpful quote that the problem with conventional racial taxonomy is not that it's impossible to classify people into these groups. Similarly, we could take people and sort them according to all kinds of base properties. The problem is that such a taxonomy does not have any privileged status over other countless ways we might divide up the species. And again, that's why race is better understood as a social division rather than a natural one. Just one other point before I start wrapping up the implications here. You know, if you're thinking, well, I think in fact that the races are natural categories that are sorted according to a certain amount of ancestry. I want to present you with the case of Susie Phipps, who very famous story about a woman who had self-identified as white her entire life, treated as white, but then in 1977, quite late in fact, discovered her great-great-great-grandmother was an enslaved African woman, and then the state of Louisiana reclassified her as Black. So imagine that maybe there were a few other ancestors in her lineage who in fact were African. On a naturalistic account of race, this newly acquired ancestral information should make us change Susie Phipps' classification, right? That she should in fact be classified as maybe mixed race or Black. The point of this exercise is to show that despite how Susie self-identified, despite her own experience, right, culturally, the thing that should determine her racial categorization is her ancestry. I think that we should take great pause in rendering that conclusion, especially given that as if you actually look to the sciences, these racial distinctions are not privileged biologically in any significant way. Okay, so what this all implies is that the rules for racial classification are in fact up to us, right? There is no fact of the matter we must abide by. And this opens up the opportunity for us to rethink race and how we want to adjudicate racial membership, right? Consider Judaism, right? I mean, we've thought about this a lot as Jews, and Jews certainly are a racialized group, but what's fascinating is that Jews permit conversion. Of course, there are lots of different views on that, and it's something maybe that we can talk about. But it is quite notable that Jews, while we may also acknowledge the importance of ancestry in certain contexts, we don't think that that's necessary in order to be classified as a Jew, or many of us at least don't think so, or I would argue we ought not to think so. And so my claim, my further claim that I won't have time to fully defend here, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about all this, is that we shouldn't require proof of recent ancestry to validate racial membership. Rather, I think we should care more about things like self-identification, sincerity, right? Not merely stated self-identification, but whether or not you sincerely identify as a member of the relevant race, personal communal ties, feelings of belonging to a racialized group. I think these are the things that ought to matter when it comes to classifying racially. And this obviously has implications for transracial individuals, because it would turn out then that what we should look at is not these individuals' ancestries. It won't be like, ta-da, look at this picture I found of someone when they were a child. Turns out they were lying and let's jettison them from society. Rather, we should find out more about why it is that they identify as they do, and consider revising our rules of racial membership on that basis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tuvel. So thought-provoking. I would love to open the floor now for questions, either verbal questions, or if you want to put them in the chat, I can read them aloud to the group. I know something that struck me during your lecture is the relationship between the way we understand gender and the evolving way we understand gender and the evolving way we understand race. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about how those parallel sort of experiences or thought processes have informed one another.
Yes, that's an excellent question. Thank you for it. So I do argue that we ought to start thinking more about racial identity the way that we are increasingly thinking about gender identity. In other words, there is a growing number of people who identify racially in ways that are at odds with the standard criteria for racial categorization, the same way that there's a growing number of people who identify in terms of gender in a way that's at odds with standard criteria for ascribing gender, namely the sex that you're born into, right? And so I think that analogy between transgender and transrace is actually fruitful, and I've argued in a 2017 paper in defense of transracialism alongside that analogy. Unfortunately, it was met with significant backlash, but I maintain that the argument is sound. So yes, I think it's a very fruitful comparison. And I also think that it helps us think about individuals like Gladden, who identify as both transgender and transracial, because I think it would be odd for my critics to say, well, we're going to approve of the part of Gladden that identifies as transgender, but not the part of Gladden that identifies as transracial. I think that's an untenable position to hold.
Thank you. Dr. Kaplowitz, I saw your virtual hand was up. Did you have a question? I don't know if you can hear me. Well, there are a couple more questions in the chat. So one,
sorry about that. I was having a hard time. I was having a hard time figuring out how to unmute. I was also going to ask about gender, but I'll take it a slightly different question actually. Ibram X. Kendi in his book says that race is an illusion, but one that we do well to see. And I'm curious, why do we want to keep the category of race at all? And if it's socially constructed, why can't we socially jettison it?
Excellent question. So I'm actually with you on that. And I think that the right answer to that question is to get beyond race eventually. We need to start deconstructing race. And where that begins is with the illusion that ancestry is necessary to be categorized as a member of a given race. So I actually think that what we're seeing with transgender is we're starting to get beyond gender. Some people don't see it that way, right? They think that transgender actually entrenches gender because it perpetuates certain gender or ideas about gender and how it is that we should present as women or men or otherwise. I don't think that's what's happening at all. I actually think that the disconnect between how somebody is sexed and how they present in terms of gender is opening up the space for all kinds of different expressions with respect to gender. And we're starting to see the kind of the breaking up of gender. And of course, we see people identifying beyond the gender binary, gender queer and agender and all of this. So I think a similar thing with race, right? Race is an illusion, at least as we typically understand it to be like a biologically significant category that's not well explained by the sciences. But we should, in fact, in order to get beyond race, we should start loosening up membership criteria for what it means to be a member of a racialized group. And I think eventually what that will turn into is that we speak about cultures rather than races, because I think then the notion of race is still very much kind of biologically anchored. So like my ultimate goal is to be what's called like an eliminativist about race. But in the interim, I think the way to get there is to challenge beliefs about criteria for racial membership. Sorry, that was kind of rambling. And you had such a succinctly articulated question. So I hope that made some sense.
If I could follow up then, is there a meaningful difference on that view between race and ethnicity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the meaningful difference between race and ethnicity is that race is still widely believed to be a biologically kind of significant categorization, whereas I think that people acknowledge or people think differently about ethnic groups. So it is kind of part of challenging our understanding of race that we ultimately start to replace race with ethnicity eventually. I mean, I think the thing about race too that's different from ethnicity is that people have been oppressed as members of races, and that it has been really important and continues to be important to recognize the way that certain people are treated as lesser on the basis of being grouped according to like a set of imagined features, real or imagined, namely, their recent ancestry. So those are really deep and important questions. And all I can say is that I try to deal with them more in my book. So sorry for the too quick reply there. Great questions, Mark Kaplowitz. Thank you.
And Charles posted a good question relevant to that point in the chat, which is mixed race analogous to non-binary? Like from a language perspective, would those be sort of considered the same?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that you would probably, the better comparison for somebody who has like a non-binary gender, or somebody who kind of rejects the binary entirely. I mean, it depends on how it is that they identify. Do they identify with part of the binary kind of sometimes, and do they switch their identification as a man or a woman depending on the circumstances, or do they entirely reject the binary construction of gender? I think that some mixed race individuals will compare well to non-binary if they kind of participate or as identifying in multiple races, but then other individuals who just kind of reject racial classification entirely, and who say that they only identify maybe as members of an ethnicity and that they don't have a racial identity, might speak to the second sense of non-binary, sort of rejecting the entire paradigm.
Awesome, thank you. There's another question in the chat, which is, why do you think that many in-members are so threatened and resist people joining or transitioning into their identified community?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, I think the answer differs for different racial groups. I think that the answer for Black Americans, for instance, has to do with fears related to the exploitation of affirmative action benefits, for instance, right? So are there going to now be white people kind of falsely claiming to be Black or to be a minority in order to get certain benefits, right, that are intended for Black Americans, right? That's certainly a legitimate worry. And I think that for many people, what binds them together as members of races is the fact that they have had a shared experience of oppression. And there's a feeling that individuals transitioning in don't have that history or are simply not going to experience the racial oppression in the same way as, so-called native members of the race. So I think those are just two reasons why people tend to be skeptical and concerned. And in fact, I mean, you hear similar kinds of concerns voiced, going back to the analogy to transgender, on behalf of so-called natal females who reject transgender inclusion. So there are parallels there as well. And I think the right response to all these concerns is not simply to say that they have no validity, but rather to think carefully about how we can both respect people's legitimate worries and be inclusive. So I don't think that you would have to deny that ancestry, for instance, is still really important to the racial identity of some people. The same way that for some women, the fact that they, have certain biological features, right, that they can give birth, that they have periods, right, that might be really important to some women's sense of womanhood, but that doesn't mean that being a woman requires that you also have that experience, right? So I think that's the key distinction that I want to hold on to, that we can have more capacious categories of and requirements for membership without necessarily telling other people that what was important to them, right, for being a member of that category just isn't important anymore, right? So, it really just, that's going to come down to people's own self-identities and what matters to them. So as a Jew, for myself, it is important to my self-identity as a Jew that both my grandfathers were survivors, for instance. But that doesn't mean that I think that you can't be a Jew, right? Unless you also, have a family who descended from Holocaust survivors, right? So that's the distinction that I would make there. And then I also want to get to Charles's first question here. Is it still okay to disapprove of people who lie to claim a benefit? I would say absolutely, right? That there is a distinction between like a genuinely transracial individual and somebody who's just lying about their race to get a benefit. So some of you might be familiar with the comedian Mindy Kaling's brother, who lied on a medical school application saying that he was Black in order to make it easier to get in. And that's just a straightforward case of like lying to claim a benefit. This wasn't a genuine identity on his part. And I would say that's unethical. And there's certainly is a big distinction between someone like that, somebody who genuinely embraces the identity.
Yeah, Jocelyn.
I was struck by the fact that the woman, she wrote In Full Color, who was a director of the NAACP chapter, she got more grief, of course, from the white community. It was the Black community who said, we don't care, and embraced her. I thought that was an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's fascinating to track like who seems to get most up in arms about these different forms of identification. And, you know, it wasn't only white people who were upset. I mean, there certainly were enough voices within Black communities also objecting to Dolezal. However, it's true that within her own localized Black community, she had many supporters. But also, vitriol seems to focus much more on women than men who identify as transracial, is something also to notice. And that's especially concerning.
That brings up another issue, but
yeah.
I'm also concerned about the fact that with post-slavery, then Jim Crow, and systemic racism, the treatment of white supremacy over inferiority.
I think you unmuted.
I'm sorry.
There you go.
I've also been concerned about the issue of post-slavery and then racism and systemic racism, and as it's gone down the generations, that we have, because of white supremacy, begun to create attributes that worry me. I worry that we, particularly in the South, North isn't exempt, but created a permanent underclass. And it scares me because we have children having children for generations. You know, we have generations of lack of good literacy. And I worry about creating attributes, racial attributes that wouldn't have been there absent slavery, racism, etc. That's of concern. Have you given thought to that?
Yes, I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So is your concern specifically with respect to transracial ways of identifying, or just in general?
No, just in general, that because of our racism, we are creating negative racial aspects socially on folks by keeping them in inferior positions that get harder and harder and harder to break out of.
Yes, I totally agree, and I think, you know, we see the ongoing legacy of slavery in this country, and especially in this city, and ongoing manifestations of racism all the time, all around us. And I think that part of what I'm arguing is that if we trace it all the way back to its origin, it is this fictitious notion of race, right? The idea that some people are naturally inferior, right? And that it's traceable to something in their genetics, right? And that's how it is that they ended up where they are, right? That's in fact the notion that we need to dispel, and we need to continue talking about what it means to say that race is an illusion, even though of course we see the effects of race's illusion all around us all the time, similar to the way that, you know, in the example I gave, you could see concrete effects to people being sorted according to eye color, whatever base property it is that you pick. It's arbitrary, but it has very real and ongoing social and political effects. So we have to really learn to speak carefully about what these categories are, because there's so much confusion around them. So I agree entirely with you.
Carl's posted another great question in the chat, which is how can you tell if someone's lying about, you know, how can you get to the bottom basically of their intention, if someone's lying or if they're sincere?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think that there are different ways we can evaluate people's sincerity with respect to their self-identification. So for me, one big indicator is, you know, how long has this person been identifying as they do, right? So Ronnie Gladden actually describes their identification as, you know, consistent, persistent, and insistent. And, you know, Dolezal was identifying as a Black woman for over 15 years. And even after all of the social media shaming and everything, she still continues to identify that way. And I would say that persistence is evidence of a sincerity to the identification, right? If there is somebody who, like Mindy Kaling's brother, right, claims this identification and it's clearly tethered to a distinct benefit, and everybody else around them says, I've never heard that you identify in any way as Black. You don't seem to be at all a member of the Black community. That's evidence that it might not be sincere, right? I think it's not always easy to tell, and you know, I think this is just what we deal with in general when we're evaluating people's sincerity. But more than anything, I think we should be wary of just assuming, right, that all of these claims are insincere. Although certainly I acknowledge that you know, there are some people who might be out to lie about different features of their identity. No doubt. I mean, we see that too. But yeah, that's what I would say. How long has somebody been identifying that way? What other elements of their life can we look to see whether or not this is a sincere commitment on their part? So Dolezal, you know, has Black children. She was, you know, very active in Black activism in her community. I think those are all the sorts of things we can turn to say, seems like this is a sincere identification. Even if we can also maybe say that some things she did were immoral, we should be able to hold those things together too. Somebody's identity can be sincere, and they also may have done things that are immoral too. So we have to be nuanced and careful. And more than anything, we shouldn't take at face value just media accounts of these individuals, but as much as possible, try to listen to their own stories.
Thank you. I would love to hear a little bit more about how you came to work on this topic, sort of how your background lended itself to your interest in this topic and how it fits in to the larger scope of your work as well.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I came into this topic because when I first got to Rhodes, I was asked to teach philosophy of race and racism, and I was excited about it, although it hadn't really been an area that I had done much research in. But I started to really dive in to teach the course, and then I was regularly teaching it, and I started to get really interested in the area. And a couple years or about a year into that, the whole dolezal controversy blew up. And there was lots of discussion in the media about, Rachel Dolezal, she identifies as Black, but she has white parents. And at the same month, Caitlyn Jenner was on the cover of Vanity Fair. So, so showing a welcoming of transgender identification. And some philosophers weighed in on the Rachel Dolezal moment on a kind of popular philosophy blog. And they all pretty much argued that the analogy was not to be made, and that in fact, transracial is not a thing, right? That Dolezal is just lying about her race, and that this isn't really an identity category that we should take seriously. And, as a philosopher, I just look at the arguments, and I thought that their arguments were not convincing arguments. And so I decided I would write up a piece, arguing against, their conclusion that transracial is not analogous to transgender, and that it's not a serious identity category. And I think my background informed it to the degree that, yeah, as a Jew, I suppose I sit in a space where I think membership criteria for being a Jew should be more expansive, and that I think it's a good thing that we recognize, that you could convert to Judaism, even while, for some Jews, their history of oppression might be more salient to their identity than others. So how it connects to my work in general, I would say that my work in general involves just thinking about what we owe to individuals who, especially of marginalized identities. And so to those we don't normally think we have ethical obligations to, and especially also to animals. I'm very interested in the questions about what we owe to animals. So kind of all, yeah, just I think all my work hangs together with thinking about our moral obligations to those many think we don't maybe have strong moral obligations to. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, we have time probably for one or two more questions. I know Mark Kaplowitz posted one in the chat. The concept of race is closely linked with the concept of power. How might voluntaristic concept of race change the way that social power functions? Great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. So I think absolutely, it's true that race is very much linked to power, and this also explains much of the backlash, right? That, the story about Dolezal was, here's a privileged white girl identifying as Black, to get ahead in one way or another. And that's what makes it her identification wrong. I think that my view is that we shouldn't be focusing on, individuals who may identify strongly as members of another race when it comes to addressing the issue of race and power, right? I think that problem is a much larger structural, social, and political problem that we have to deal with by, large social measures such as, combating ongoing racism and structural inequality and poverty and things that, in other words, the ongoing legacies of racism that we see and that we were talking about a little bit briefly before. I do think that transraciality could eventually be more part of a society with more egalitarian relationships among the races, right? But I don't think that it is a necessary obstacle to developing that vision either. So I would argue analogously, you might think that, you know, there's still ongoing sexism and oppression of women. And yet that doesn't preclude, you know, transgender identification, or the fact that, you know, maybe someone who's born female and then transitions to identify as male, who might gain more social power on that basis. I don't think that necessarily, you know, poses a problem for measures we take to combat sexism and more. But yes, that's a great question, and I'd love to talk to you more about that question if you want to. I'm happy to correspond via email or anything, because these are really, really rich questions, and I'm grateful for them.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I know that this is just the beginning of our conversing about all this, and I welcome anyone who wants to be put in touch with Rebecca, with Professor Tuvel, to reach out to me, and then I can connect you. And we look forward to learning more about this when your book comes out too. So definitely let us know when that happens. And in our last moments here, I will take another second to just really thank you, Professor Tuvel, for being here. Round of applause to you for sharing this incredible topic and sharing your time with us today. And lastly, I will put in a little plug for our next lecture in the series, which is on Friday, February 11th, with Professor John Hochstein from University of Memphis. He's a professor of mechanical engineering. So that's the next lecture to look forward to. And again, thank you, Dr. Tuvel. Thank you all of you for attending. Thank you for the incredible questions and discussion, and we'll see you next time.